Okay, Chairman, we're streaming live on YouTube now.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody to this virtual meeting of the Western Area Planning Committee. My name is David Beeman and I'm the chairman of this committee, and I'm supported this evening by officers Beth Howland-Smith, Lewis Jones, Chris French, Chris Turner and Kimberly Thorne, and also, of course, John Rubini, who is the vice chair of this committee. Members and officers, please use the hand raise function within Zoom to indicate you wish to speak. Please keep yourself on mute when you are not speaking. Please can I also ask that any questions are kept brief and to the point. We'll be timing speeches this evening and an alarm will sound when you've been speaking for 4 minutes. If any members in the meeting lose their connection temporarily, we will pause to allow them time to rejoin the meeting. If the webcast stream fails, then we'll also have to adjourn until we're able to reset the connection. Right, let's start with the agenda. First of all, apologies for absence and substitutes, Kimberly. Kimberly? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. We have apologies from Councillor Michaela Martin and Councillor Dan Hunt.
And the substitutes?
Is Councillor Brian Edmonds, I believe.
No, Roger Brishan, I think.
Roger Blishin, sorry.
Yeah, okay, right, okay, fine. Right, let's move on. Minutes of the last meeting. The committee to note the minutes of the meeting held on 24th of November, which are published on the council's website. Everybody happy with those? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any declarations of interest received tonight, Kimberly?
None received, Chairman.
No, okay. Questions by members of the public?
None received, Chairman.
And questions from members?
None received, Chairman.
Okay. Are Beth or Chris, are there any relevant updates to government guidance or legislation since the last meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. No, nothing for members this evening.
All right, okay. And then application to planning commission. Please note that the polling feature within Zoom has been set up so that votes for the following items can be made either by general assent or by using the polling. If a recorded vote is required, this will be done by roll call. Application and delegated powers. Any decision on the delegated powers?
None since the last meeting, Chairman.
Very good. Okay, fine. Which brings us on to the one item tonight we have on the agenda, which is WA 2020-1065, land at 3 Hampton Terrace, Beacon Hill Road, Hindhead. And the officer to present is Chris Turner, I believe. Yes?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Good evening, members. Land at 3 Hampton Terrace, Beacon Hill Road, Hindhead is an application for the erection of a dwelling. The application site is located to the rear of 3 Hampton Terrace and comprises a vacant plot of overgrown land enclosed along the boundaries by a mixture of close board fence and vegetation. The site is bound by residential buildings to the northeast, far east, south and southwest, and to the north of the site lies a public car park. Access to the site is via tarmac track which joins Beacon Hill Road between numbers 5 and 6 Beacon Hill Road. This track also provides pedestrian access from the public car park to the parade of shops. The aerial photograph shows the site in the context of the surrounding development. This slide shows the site layout plan. The proposal will be accessed via a track to the east. There would be no vehicular access to the site. This would be restricted by a pedestrian gate presented at the entrance to the site. The dwelling would have a similar scale and depth to the adjoining neighbours and would feature an amenity space to the north. The proposal is traditional in design. It features a pitch roof and will be finished in render. There are first floor windows serving the 2 bedrooms located on the northeast and northwest. First floor windows located on the north elevation and the east and west elevations. There have been 3 previous applications of note on the site. WA 2018-1201 was for 4 dwellings. This was refused based on its impact on the adjoining neighbour at 2 Jacaranda Cottages for providing a poor standard of accommodation and unsatisfactory living conditions, a lack of on-site parking, and in relation to information relating to the Wealdon Heath SPA. The copy of the reasons for refusal are in the report also. 2019-0407 was an application for 4 flats. This was also refused based on its impact on 2 Jacaranda Cottages, providing a poor standard of accommodation and unsatisfactory living conditions for future occupiers, and failure to provide on-site vehicular parking. This application was taken to appeal, where it was dismissed by the planning inspectorate. It was refused for 2 reasons. It was dismissed for 2 reasons. It was harm to the living conditions of the occupiers of 2 Jacaranda Cottages in respect of outlook, daylight and sunlight impact. And it was not, as the council has concluded, providing satisfactory living conditions for future occupiers of the upper floor flats in respect of outlook. However, in the assessment of this appeal site, the inspector noted that the site was in an accessible location close to bus stops, and therefore it was not a location where the occupants need to be reliant on a private car for the day-to-day requirements. The inspector took account of the inclusion of cycle storage and the small size of the flats, and concluded that the development would not result in materially harmful impacts on the living conditions of local residents due to lack of on-site parking provision. Whilst that appeal was received, prior to that appeal decision being received, another application was submitted for 1 dwelling, which is similar to the proposal which is before you this evening. This application was refused for 3 reasons. There was insufficient space could be provided on site for vehicles to park and turn. It failed to provide adequate on-site parking spaces, and insufficient information been provided to demonstrate that the covered bin storage could be provided within the site. However, it is material that on that appeal decision for the previous proposal, the inspector identified no harm from the lack of on-site parking. Photograph A in the top left is looking southeast towards the site. The dwelling would be located between the 2 buildings that you can see on screen. Jacaranda Cottages is located to the right of this picture. Photograph B shows the entrance to the site, where access would be limited to pedestrians via the provision of a gate. Photograph C shows the site from the east. 2 Jacaranda Cottages can be seen in the distance. Photograph D shows the view from the garden of number 3 Hampton Terrace. Photograph E in the bottom right shows the view of the site from the parking area serving Jacaranda Cottages. Photograph F shows the entrance to the site from Hampton Terrace. Photograph G shows the existing condition of the site looking towards a car park. And photograph H shows a garden area, the rear garden area of Jacaranda cottages. Photographs I and J show Jacaranda cottages and the location of windows on this property. The proposal would provide a two-storey dwelling of traditional design in the developed area. It is noted that no parking is provided on site. However, on the appeal decision for 2019-0407, the inspector noted that the site is in an accessible location within walking distance of local retail and community facilities and services, and close to bus stops for services including Hazelmere, Hindhead, Farnham and Aldershot. The inspector did not consider that this is a location where occupants need to be reliant on a private car for their day-to-day requirements. On the application, he also gave weight to the small scale of the flats proposed and the cycle storage facilities, which he considered lent to an increase in the likelihood of occupiers of the appeal scheme using alternative means of transport other than the private car. The appeal was not therefore dismissed on a lack of parking. Given the scale of the dwelling before you tonight and the provision of cycle storage, officers consider it reasonable to consider that a lack of parking provision on this proposal would not be a suitable reason for refusal. The provision of minimum parking standards in Waverley's parking guidelines is a material consideration, but should be treated as guidance only, as should the Surrey County Council guidelines, where they operate at maximum standards, which allow for parking to be reduced in sustainable locations if appropriate provision is made to encourage non-car use. Paragraph 9 of ST1 of the local plan refers to making appropriate provision for parking, having regard to the type of development and its location in accordance to local standards. Having regard to the sustainable location of the site, it's reasonable to consider the application before you on the basis of no parking being provided, and there is no direct policy or other conflict which would stop members from approving or refusing the development without parking should they consider it appropriate to do so. On visual harm and residential harm, there is no visual or residential harm identified by the proposal. The proposal is therefore considered acceptable, and as such, planning permission is recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chris. Right, okay, we have a public speaker, Martin Burt, in support of the application. Martin, you have 4 minutes when you start talking.
That's very nice of you, Chairman. Yes, I'm the managing agent for 3 Hampton Terrace, and have been involved with the application Uplands Property Investments Limited throughout the various planning applications to develop the above site. The planning officers provide a very good background to the attempts in the report to this application. There have been letters submitted with varying reasons to oppose this development, 4 of which were pre-submitted to the amendments to this application. Planning issues were discussed with the planning officer to overcome the concerns and also those of the objectors. New drawings were prepared to address these points, and then only 1 letter was received post the amended drawings received post those amendments. The application has now been supported by the planning officer to recommend the approval of the scheme with certain conditions attached. If the planning committee have any issues they wish to raise, I'll be more than happy to respond. Also, my clients are otherwise in the background to this hearing, and I'm happy to be approached if I cannot respond directly to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Burt. Right, Councillor Hyman has asked to speak. Councillor Hyman, you have 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Yes, if I may refer you, please, to the committee papers at the top of page 14, you'll see that the reason for refusal back in September 2018 was that there's insufficient information submitted to demonstrate the proposal in combination with other projects would not have a likely significant effect on the Weldon Heaths, and because the council could not undertake an appropriate assessment. This was at the time, of course, when the council was obeying the law after the decision by the courts in April 2018, the People over Wind Sweetman judgments. In May 2018, following that People over Wind ruling, the head of planning quite correctly announced a moratorium that was necessary pending information to complete an appropriate assessment from Natural England. And of course, until October of that year, when Natural England said, well, you're going to have to go back to where you were before, just ignoring the constraints. Obviously, because this application was done in September, it was quite correctly refused on the grounds that are at paragraph 4 there on page 10 of 28, page 14 of your papers. So we don't have an appropriate assessment, and of course, so paragraph 177 of the National Planning Policy Framework says, and I quote, "The presumption in favour of sustainable development does not apply where the plan or project is likely to have a significant effect on a habitat site, either alone or in combination with other plans projects, unless an appropriate assessment has concluded that it will not adversely affect the integrity of the habitat site." Well, yet again, we don't have an appropriate assessment. So when you look at at page 12 of your officer report, paragraph 10, it tells you the presumption in favour of sustainable development applies. Of course, it doesn't. You don't have an appropriate assessment. The officers are pretending here that the fact that unspecified open space somewhere might mitigate this is a way of getting around the law and just ignoring it. That's the old story, obviously, which is not a lawful approach, because you would need an appropriate assessment to show that that's true, that the impact, which is admitted to in a condition for in the refusal number 4 there of the first refusal, that obviously admits that there is an in combination effect, and we know there is. So, Chairman, you note that when Waverley correctly refuses on habitats grounds, the planning inspectorate has to agree. The habitats compliance forces the planning inspectorate to act lawfully as well. And this rather upsets the system of planning by appeal, of course. So tonight, members can decide for themselves whether you want proper, lawful planning with councillors having control over inappropriate development, or whether you want planning by appeal where councillors have no control over inappropriate development because of the system of planning by appeal. I know which option Hazelmere residents would expect you to support. I think you could probably give them a very happy Christmas by deciding that you were going to go back to the lawful approach used when the first of these applications was refused in accordance with the law of People over Wind judgment. Or you can, of course, decide for yourselves that you're going to ignore the obvious logic here, turn a blind eye, and not upset the planning by appeal system. But I would suggest it's easiest for you to just ensure, if you refuse this, or when you refuse this, because the law requires it, it is determinative, that condition, reason number 4 at the top of page 14 is included amongst your reasons, and that's what residents will be looking for, I'm sure. So thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Before I go into the bit, Councillor Lewis Jones, do you want to answer that particular point?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, happy to make a brief comment on it. Just if you could just bear with me a second, I'm just getting a copy of that report up. I haven't had a chance to look at it before today's meeting. This is in relation to the 2018 permission Councillor Hyman referred to. I can see that the reason was added, the habitats reason that is, but it actually looks like it may have been added in error, because if you look at the officer report section on effect on spas, it concludes that an appropriate assessment wasn't required. And that was in accordance with Natural England's recommendation as well. And I also can't see any reference made to habitats in the appeal decision either. But more broadly, I would just say that Natural England aren't objecting to our recommendation here. We base our decision in relation to the Wilden Heath Spa on the information that's contained in the appropriate assessment that was prepared for the local plan part 1. And we're perfectly entitled as a local planning authority to conclude that a scheme will not have likely significant effects on a spa, meaning that an appropriate assessment isn't required. And in this case, we base that decision on the fact that, as set out in the local plan's appropriate assessment, the Wilden Heath Spa is under far less pressure from development generally. And I think in the appropriate assessment, Natural England actually recommended that appropriate assessments would only really be necessary for major developments within the 5-kilometre buffer zone. So that's really what we're relying on here in order to come to the conclusion that we have come to. So I think the officer recommendation is satisfactory in that sense. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Isherwood.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I hope members of the committee have been able to see this site, not least because the drawings on our file and in the committee papers, as I would say, are somewhat lacking in clarity. And the photographs do not do the small plot justice. It in fact makes it look very much bigger. This is an application for a small house in a very small plot. The government technical housing standards, nationally prescribed space standards, require dwellings to meet a certain internal space standards. While Waverley doesn't have a local plan policy in respect of those standards at this time, we should use them as a guide. The minimum space for a 2-bedroom dwelling is 70 square metres. This proposed dwelling is 70 square metres. The second bedroom doesn't comply with the standard, as it's only 7.02 square metres, as opposed to the 7.5 square metres in the standard space standard. The second bedroom is conditioned to have an obscure glazed window, but I suggest, members, that in such a small bedroom, the window may well be open, often making the obscure glazing a pointless exercise. Sorry, it's not good enough. The Waverley Residential Extension SPD states that a 2-storey rear and front extension should be at least 2 metres from a boundary with a neighbouring property. But this application shows the first floor projection to the rear of the property would be within 1.88 metres of the shared boundary with number 2 Jacaranda cottages. Again, I don't find it acceptable to avoid what is a clear guideline. There's no space for any car parking, and there's no access for a car, but there is a bicycle rack. Access to this proposed dwelling is at the rear of 11 and 12 Hampton Terrace. That sadly wasn't shown in the photographs, with a path that is approximately 2 metres wide leading to this gated enclosure. It's 2 metres wide, and it passes their rear windows and past their refuse, recycling and food caddies. A loss of amenity to those residents that's not acceptable, as one of the residents pointed out to me when I walked down that path. The report states that having regard to the appealing inspector's conclusion, officers are satisfied that on-site parking is not a requirement in this case. Sorry, I do not accept that. The Waverley standard that requires 2 car parking spaces should not be ignored. It was set in 2013. In Beacon Hill, we already have 18 dwellings that were created with no off-road parking whatsoever. We've seen shops and offices converted under PDO over a period of time, of which approximately half were converted while we waited for the application for Regulation 4 to be implemented. Those dwellings with no off-road parking use the Beacon Hill car park, which is at present a free site. Currently, there are 29 cars parked there at night, leaving just 21 spaces vacant. Many of those cars are also there during the day. One hopes to see a continual flow of cars during the day. I was there last night at 9 p.m. There were 29 cars. 7 o'clock this morning, I was there again. 29 cars, all frost covered. I speak also as a local school governor when I say that we encourage parents to use the car park where they stop to walk their children to school. There's no stopping in Beacon Hill Road outside the school, that's prohibited. If we continue to provide free off-road parking to developers, this facility will surely be lost, while the remaining traders would find life very difficult to continue with their operations. Should Waverley Borough Council be maintaining a car park at our council payers' expense and giving developers the advantage of free parking for their developments? Seems to me to be the wrong way round. The various parking surveys quoted are not something I recognise, as the Beacon Hill Road, Grove Road are heavily parked on both sides of the road. Sometimes it's suggested there should be a 20 is plenty speed limit on Beacon Hill Road and Hill Road. This was ridiculed because the parking on both sides of the road, leaving a narrow gap down the middle of the road, which by itself induces a factor of care, and 20 is plenty was thrown out. The application is an overdevelopment and merely adds another cramped development to an already overdeveloped area to the north of Beacon Hill Road. I consider there's a loss of neighbour amenity, a lack of amenity to the occupiers of the proposed dwelling, a cramped overdevelopment of the site, a lack of car parking contrary to Waverley Borough Council's requirement. I must add, officers, that I find the letter to the planning officer from AJ Carr dated the 10th of September to be threatening in the extreme when he says, if permission is refused, we will be left with no alternative than to appeal and recover costs from Waverley. Councillors, we're all aware of our collective responsibility. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Either Councillor Rubini or Councillor Keane.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's Councillor Rubini. May I first of all apologise for my lateness. My Wi-Fi completely collapsed and I had to reboot everything, and my laptop doesn't work now, so I've gone onto my tablet. I can see and hear, as can Councillor Keane. Going on to this, I would support everything that Councillor Peter Isherwood so eloquently described. I went down there myself at 11 o'clock this morning. The car park, I think, had 4 spaces. It is used frequently. Certainly, I went down there over several years when I used to work in that area, and that car park is well used, and particularly, again, as Councillor Isherwood said, it is used by schools. I don't like this. I think it is definitely too big for that space. I looked at the hedge because I couldn't see into the property itself, and there is very little space between the 2 houses, and they're trying to cram this in. I am sure there are architects available that could design something that would leave more space between the housing. I don't understand why they're trying to cram something like this in. A 1-bedroom perhaps facing the other way so that you had gaps between the housing, I would have thought would have been a much more suitable concern. As far as the photograph F is concerned that we were shown, and said that was the entrance, I couldn't actually see the entrance from there. I assume it was slightly to the left of photograph F. I'm not quite sure what it was showing. So I'm sorry, but I am against this. It's overdevelopment. It's far too close to the boundaries of the other places. And I agree again, we shouldn't be breaking these guidelines. We should be complying with them. Thank you, Chair.
So, Councillor Deere.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have less of a problem with the layout and design of this proposal. And I think it answers a lot of the questions that were raised at the appeal process. But the thing that strikes me as a matter of concern is the parking situation. I've read the inspector's decision and I vigorously disagree with what he says. To my mind, his own personal prejudices infected the nature and of the opinion that he expressed in that appeal about cars and parking. Waverley has a perfectly decent, respectable and reasonable car parking standard that it applies to new developments. The principle being, basically in my understanding, is that traffic and vehicles generated by a development are contained within that development, and that is not the case as far as this is concerned. Therefore, I'm very glad that we have our friend Mr. Lewis with us tonight as the planning solicitor. And the question I would like to ask him is that would any future inspector be irrevocably bound by the opinion expressed on the previous at the previous appeal as far as this matter is concerned? If the answer is yes, I think we are in a very difficult position indeed to refuse this. If the answer is no, and we are able to take a separate opinion from the one previously expressed, then yeah, I have a real problem with the fact that this proposal does not contain the parking it will generate within the site itself. And the fact that it's near a bus stop or two, is a matter of complete irrelevance as far as I'm concerned. The phrase is that the occupant wouldn't be reliant on a private car for their day-to-day requirements because they've got an irregular and infrequent bus service. But I just don't think that's just nonsense. The owners will have a car, the owners will buy a car, the owners will want somewhere to put it. And to my mind, that should be on the site. So, Mr. Lewis, are you able to express an opinion on that, please?
Mr. Lewis.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Chairman. If you wouldn't mind, I would just like to quickly just revisit the inspector's comments myself before answering, if that's okay, and possibly provide an answer in a little later on during the discussion when a suitable break arises, if that's okay.
Can I just say, it was the principle that I am asking about, not the actual detail. The principle being, would any future inspector be irrevocably bound by the previous inspector's views on this subject?
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying. I just want to revisit the comments just to get the impression of his overall conclusions. The point I just want to have a look at is the extent to which this is a point of interpretation of our policy, or not really. If it's an issue as to how one is interpreting policy, then I think it's a point that we would have to take a view on. Do we disagree with his interpretation or not? And if we do, then we would have to argue that at any future appeal and try and convince a second inspector that actually the interpretation given by that inspector was wrong and it should be interpreted in this way. So well, I think that's the point.
I certainly think he's wrong, but you know, I'm not a lawyer, so you know, and until I get that opinion, you know, I'm not going to be able to know which way to vote. If you know, if we got no choice, basically, then you know, I'm not going to stand in the way. I'm not going to be part of a process that throws up an appeal where the chances of success are extremely limited. But as a matter of principle, I certainly have a problem with this as it's proposed at the moment on the parking issue. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I may, I think it comes to the issue of, as I say, I would like to just revisit his comments briefly, but I think he came to that conclusion largely on the basis that the location of development is in his view highly sustainable. So from that point of view, he thought that there was scope in our policy to conclude that it was acceptable in planning terms for the development not to provide a parking space. So on the sustainability point, that's a matter of planning judgment. Now, I think any inspector or planning committee would be perfectly entitled to conclude differently on the sustainability point, i.e. you could conclude that it isn't as sustainable in your view as the inspector had concluded. So definitely that point, I think a different view could be taken either by yourselves as the committee or by a future inspector. The point on policy, you know, interpreting the policy is a little less straightforward, but I think the point is that our policy probably does allow for, in principle, schemes to not provide parking spaces where appropriate. I don't think our policy prohibits that explicitly.
But presumably this may be some element of precedent. You know, if we get developments near bus stops in the future, then we don't have to provide parking, which is, I think, is a dangerous precedent. But anyway, I've said enough. I beg your pardon, Mr. Chairman, and I'll let Mr. Jones go and do his research. Thanks.
It does help. I mean, the bus service there is pretty basic. It's an hourly service. There's no evening service, there's no Sunday service, and perhaps that was never taken into account. But there we are. Right, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll come to the planning and the parking in a sec, but I think looking at the town council's comments, they are perfectly adequate. Loss of neighbours' amenity and loss of amenity for the occupiers. It's printed in black and white, and according to local plan and 4 conditions of local plan, I think. But coming back to the parking, there seems to be a rash of applications coming before the committee where if the site is beside a bus stop or a station or a rickshaw, we seem to have to say that our parking guidance is no longer valid. Well, I think that's completely wrong. Are we saying that the occupants of this dwelling are only allowed to go to Hazelmere, they're only allowed to go to Aldershot, they're only allowed to go to Farnham? Well, they might want to go somewhere else. I think that'll be enough for me, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Adams. You muted, Councillor Adams.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I agree with Councillor Isherwood as well. As far as buses are concerned, in the Western villages, we have bus stops all over the place, and those services no longer run. So it's all very well saying, oh, well, the bus services now, but will there be bus services next year? No idea. I think that the other thing that has struck me really, I think that on page 11, this is the first time I've actually seen one part of Waverley disagreeing with the other part of Waverley, because Waverley Environmental and Regulatory Services are obviously very unhappy with this proposal. They don't like the fact that you can't get any vehicles up to the door, so which means that, of course, you've got people and emergency services having to walk to the entrance all the time if the need arises. And they obviously are very concerned about it. So I think that's another issue as far as this particular development is concerned. I mean, it has obviously just been squeezed in. I mean, it's much too close to other buildings. So I can't see that this is a good idea at all, especially as we are now okay as far as our overall housing figures are concerned. And we're back now down to 5% as a reserve. So there's no need actually for us to squeeze houses in, but into an already heavily built up area. Thank you. That's my view.
Councillor Colburn.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'm very unhappy about this. As anyone who's heard me on the planning committee over the years, I really object to obscure glazing in a habitable room. I just feel it's a sign that something's wrong with the design when you have to do that. I always have. I think it's very different from when the inspector was looking at 4 flats, where you could still argue that flat dwellers, could use a car, but we're looking here at a small house. So, logically, the people who are going to be in this house, or say people, we're assuming that there'll be more than one. And we seem to be going back in time. There was a time when we didn't provide parking because we hadn't got cars in the numbers we have now. And we've paid the price of that by having cars parked all over the place or losing the front garden to put a car on. Here, we're forcing them to do that anyway by saying, there's no room for a car. I am very uneasy about this. I think it's a compromise too far to try and get this particular house on this particular plot. And whereas I take, the suggestion that we're fairly close to services and therefore perhaps reliance on the car isn't quite as great. As I always say, people like my son live near the station and don't need the car to get to the station in Farnham to go to work, but they still have a car for the weekend to take the family out. So, and that where they live is a rows of 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom houses. They're not big houses. So, I am worried about this. I think we are compromising too much to fit this particular house in. And I do think we're cutting corners on both the size, on the amenity by having obscure glazing in a habitable room, and also on the parking. I think it's a backward step. We cannot put the genie back in the bottle, You can't just say to people, you've got to go on your bike. People will make their own choice quite rightly. And I think we have to give them that option. Thank you.
Councillor Keane, I suspect, is the next person to speak. Muted.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I agree with all the comments. I did, as did Councillor Rubini. We both went to have a look at this site this morning, and I believe that it's a very small plot, overdevelopment, and certainly a loss of amenity. But I'm more concerned about the parking issue because it's irrelevant to say you're near a bus stop, because if you work and you have to start very early in the morning, there isn't a bus. If you are a person that finishes work at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, there isn't a bus. So these people are going to need a car, whether it can be argued or not, they're on a bus service. And the other thing that concerns me is today we saw there were only 4 parking spaces in that car park in sort of late morning. Now, where is there going to be parking for people that want to use the shops? I mean, if this becomes just a car park for developers, then what is the point? It's so bad. So I am really concerned about the parking issue. And like Councillor Coburn, I cannot bear to see obscure glass in a bedroom. I think that's appalling. So for me, I cannot support this planning application. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Edmonds.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've done a lot of benchmarking on parking standards, and essentially the first thing I noticed is that the Waverley Borough Council parking guidance is out of date. The government updated its policy in 2015. So until we incorporate the 2015 update, we're working on a false assumption. As far as I can see, the minimum that you could possibly allow on this site is 1 parking space. It also doesn't comply with TD1, D1 and D4. Therefore, under those circumstances, I could not support it. Then comes the final point. How on earth do they put plant and materials on this site to construct the property? This to me looks like a ridiculous application. There is no way that I could support it on the grounds that I've just given. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. All right, Councillor Isherwood.
Thanks for letting me come back, Chairman. Just the point there that you cannot take vehicles down that public footpath. That is a fact.
Thank you very much. Right, well, we'll have to move, I think, now. No more speaking. No more to speak. Move to the recommendation, which is at...
Chairman, apologies for interrupting. May I just make a final comment?
Yes, please do.
Just further to my earlier comments regarding parking. I've had a chance just to look at the appeal decision, and I do still take the view that nothing in there prevents the committee from taking a different decision, as many of the inspector's conclusions were matters of planning judgment, which he took a view on in finding that it wouldn't be materially harmful. However, I think it is important just to note that obviously, the inspector's decision would be a material consideration for any future inspector looking at an appeal if one were to be made, and therefore I think it's particularly important for members to clarify and give reasons for taking a different view to the inspector, and really departing from the judgment that he made. And I appreciate that some of the comments probably that have already been made have done that, but I just wanted to reiterate before the vote was carried out that I think it's particularly important that members make their reasons very clear in this case, with the inspector's comments in mind, just to guard against any possible costs that may be applied for if an appeal is made.
Thank you very much. I would just reiterate the point that the bus service concerned is very basic. It's hourly, and it's no Sunday service, no evening service. And really, to say that that's a very useful service, I think is very questionable. Wait a minute. Let's move to the recommendation. The recommendation is that subject to conditions 1 to 14 and avoids 1 to 15, permission be granted. Kimberly, can you please put the poll?
Councillor Keane against.
Thank you. So if I share the results there, that's 9 in favour, 14 against, and no abstentions.
All right, thank you very much. Well, no need for alternative recommendation. Anybody wish to propose anything? Yes, Councillor Isherwood. Muted.
Sorry, Chairman. I propose refuse.
I'll second that.
Reasons for now, if we go into reasons, one thing I think I'll state right at the point made by Councillor Hyman, I think it's calling into question our officers' integrity, and I will say that really that shouldn't be one of the reasons for refusal at all in this particular matter. But anyway, anyone want to put reasons forward?
Can I start? Can I start?
Go on then.
Right. Loss of amenity, contrary to policy TD1 of the local plan part 1 and the SAVE policy D1, D4 of the 2002 plan. Lack of amenity for the occupiers of the proposed dwelling, contrary to TD1 of the local plan part 1, SAVE policy D4 of the local plan 2002. It's a cramped overdevelopment of the site and a lack of car parking contrary to Waverley's requirement.
Very comprehensive. Anybody wish to add to that?
There's construction, because I thought that was something that Councillor Edmonds suggested, which I thought was appropriate, that it would be very difficult to, if you can't take vehicles up there for construction, I think that would be a problem.
Not usually a reason for refusal, though, is it, Chairman?
No. Chris French, I think, is put his hand up.
It's the developer's problem. He can take it up, one brick at a time if he has to. It's not a planning matter.
Chris French, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, just to kind of reiterate along the lines of what Councillor Deere was saying there, that it's something that would be unlikely to represent a reason for refusal. The construction process itself is something that is temporary and can, there is normally a way of constructing a proposal, albeit that there might be a temporary impact, but wouldn't be one that I would suggest refusing on. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Right, have we got some final words? We'll look to Chris French or Chris Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, taking on board the comments made by Councillor Isherwood, so I'm proposing in relation to parking, 2 reasons are put forward. The first one being that the proposed development would fail to provide on-street vehicular parking spaces to meet the requirements of Waverley Borough Parking Council parking guidelines. Furthermore, it's not considered to be served by an appropriate provision of alternative services, which would reduce the requirement for parking. Consequently, the proposed development will be likely to result in inconvenience to surrounding residents as a result of on-street and public car parking. The proposal would therefore fail to comply with policy TD1 of the local plan, retain policies D1 and D4 of the 2002 plan, the parking guidelines, and section 9 of the MPPF. The second reason in relation to that is that it's not been demonstrated that there'd be sufficient space on site for vehicles to park and turn around so they can enter and leave in a forward gear. This could result in the obstruction of free flow and safe flow of traffic, danger and inconvenience of pedestrians, and conditions prejudicial to highway safety, contrary to the objectives of policy ST1 and section 9 of the planning policy framework. In relation to amenity, can I just get some further clarification? I understand that Councillor Colburn put forward amenity for future living occupiers, but just in relation to the amenity of neighbours, what is it specifically? Is it overlooking, overshadowing, or overbearing impact? Just so I can try and be really specific in that reason. Thank you, Chair.
Well, I mean, overlooking and overbearing, I would have thought. Councillor Clark.
I was only going to raise a point that Lewis Jones, our solicitor, mentioned earlier, that if we're minded to refuse this because of car parking or lack of it, we should expand upon that as to why we believe that the inspector was perhaps incorrect on his determination. Do we have to, can I ask Lewis Jones if we have to elaborate upon that now, or is that a job for later if it comes to appeal?
I thought Chris had done quite a good job on that.
Yes. I'd agree with Councillor Colburn. Yeah, I think Chris had covered that aspect, I think.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Clark, to answer your question on that reason for refusal, I included that it furthermore, it's not considered to be served by an appropriate provision of alternative services, which would reduce the requirement for parking. That was in an attempt to elaborate on the inspector's reason.
The appropriate services you were talking about were bus services.
Yes, that's correct.
Got you. Thank you.
Okay, right now we've got the overlooking and overbearing aspects. Chris?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think I've pulled something together. So The proposed dwelling, by virtue of its size, scale, mass, design, and location, forward of the building line of 2 jacaranda cottages, would comprise an undesirable overdevelopment of the site and would be out of keeping with and detrimental to the character and appearance of the area. And by reason of its close proximity to the common boundary and in combination with its height and mass, would appear overbearing and result in a loss of light and outlook, detrimental to the amenity of the occupiers of 2 jacaranda cottages, and would therefore fail to comply with policy TD1 and retain policies D1 and D4 of the local plan, the Council Residential Extensions SPD, and the National Plan Policy Framework. Thank you, Chair.
Everybody happy with that? I see no one. Okay, right, fair enough. Shall we vote on that? Kimberly?
Councillor Keane for.
Thank you, Councillor Keane. I got one more person to vote. Yes, thank you. So if I just share the results with Councillor Keane's vote, that's 13 for the recommendation to refuse, 1 against and 1 abstention.
Okay, well then the application is refused for the reasons given, therefore. And that basically concludes tonight's meeting. There's no matter to be considered in the exempt session, and therefore no need for legal advice, and that concludes the meeting. I will advise people that the next meeting could be quite long. There could be up to 5 items on the agenda, I'm afraid. There was supposed to be one this week, but it was asked to be deferred. So be prepared for a long session next time, I'm afraid. Okay.
Councillor Rubini has his hand up, Chairman.
Yes, Councillor Rubini, yes, right.
Thank you. All it is, when you showed the results, there were no abstentions, and I thought the officer said there was 1 abstention.
It was 14 votes, 13-1, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Councillor Rubini, it was 13 in favour, 1 against and no abstentions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much.